They ruled empires, commanded armies, and wore crowns of gold, yet not one of them could outwit the absurdity of death. From monkey attacks to exploding cannons, poisoned mushrooms to toilet betrayals, these weren't just royal demises. They were punchlines written by fate. This isn't history. It's a dark comedy of power, pride, and very bad luck. Welcome to 33 Strangest Royal Deaths in History, where the crown may be heavy, but gravity is heavier. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe for more beautifully bizarre history that makes bedtime feel like a conspiracy. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it over there? We want to know who else is wide awake with this kind of content at 2 a.m. 1. King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden. The Swedish king's last official act wasn't signing a treaty, leading an army, or even issuing a decree. It was desert, 14 of them to be precise. On February the 12th, 1771, King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden sat down to what would become history's most absurd royal Last Supper. The menu was, by all accounts, a marvel of 18th century indulgence: lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and a heaping pile of semla pastries, each one served swimming in a warm bowl of spiced milk. 14 semla later, the king collapsed. Some claimed it was digestive failure, others said it was a stroke, but the royal cause of death was simply recorded as overconsumption. He ate himself to death. This was not just a medical footnote, it was a cultural punchline. And yet, Adolf Fredrik was no clown, or at least he hadn't started as one. Born into a German noble family and placed on Sweden's throne in 1751, largely as a political compromise, Adolf was never a man of decisive politics. In fact, he was widely regarded as a king in theory only, with real power in the hands of the Swedish parliament. The people called him the king who signed things. His enemies called him irrelevant. And Adolf Fredrik, well, he retreated to the only throne he could command without argument, the dinner table. Sweden in the mid-18th century was a nation of contradictions. It teetered between Enlightenment reform and medieval superstition, between royal showmanship and rising democratic pressures. And somewhere in the middle sat Adolf, carving smoked fish with royal forks while philosophers debated the death of monarchy. He was a man born into the role of figurehead and died in the role of cautionary tale. The semla, of course, became legend. A sweet wheat bun filled with almond paste and whipped cream served in hot milk. It was originally meant for Fat Tuesday, a pre-Lenten indulgence. But Adolf wasn't interested in moderation. His 14 servings were less a meal and more a manifesto. If he couldn't reign in Parliament, he could at least reign over his own appetite. In the end, the symbolism was almost poetic. A powerless monarch consumed by excess, literally. Contemporary writers were not kind. They mocked him as the king of cream and the ruler defeated by dessert. Swedish newspapers tiptoed around the official cause, but among palace staff, the details leaked fast. There were rumors of groaning, a dramatic collapse in his chair, and attendants scrambling to summon doctors who arrived too late, probably because they too were stuck in traffic behind a royal dessert cart. It's tempting to laugh, and many did, but there's something quietly tragic about a monarch whose greatest act of rebellion was overeating. In an age of kings who died on battlefields or at the tip of an assassin's blade, Adolf Fredrik met his end not in glory or gore, but bloated and gasping, surrounded by silverware and cream. History books might have skipped over him entirely, just another puppet king, just another quiet reign. But he ate his way into infamy, ensuring that school children in Sweden still whisper about the Semla king, and that February 12th now holds a strangely revered place in culinary folklore. Which raises an unsettling question. What does it mean when a king is remembered more for his stomach than his crown? And why is it that the most ridiculous royal endings often feel oddly appropriate? Maybe because they remind us that no matter how gilded the crown, the body beneath it is still absurdly, terrifyingly human. Speaking of absurd humanity, meet King Henry I of England, a man who heard all the warnings, saw all the signs, and then drowned himself in lampreys anyway. 2. King Henry I of England. For a man who ruled with iron conviction, King Henry I of England met an end that reads more like a seafood cautionary tale than the finale of a monarch. It wasn't war, treachery, or political collapse that claimed him. It was dinner. Specifically lampreys, eel-like jawless fish with suction cup mouths and the nutritional value of wet leather. By the time of his death in 1135, Henry had already outlived most of his enemies and outmaneuvered nearly all his allies. He was the youngest son of William the Conqueror, but the only one sharp enough to turn a birthright disadvantage into a 35-year reign. He seized the throne after his brother William II conveniently caught an arrow during a hunting accident, and Henry wasted no time establishing control over both England and Normandy. He was ruthless, efficient, and obsessed with order. They called him Henry Beauclerc, the Scholar King, not because he was gentle, but because he was smart enough to pretend to be. He reformed the royal bureaucracy, centralized justice, and kept barons in check with a mixture of law and intimidation. But beneath the surface of all that cold governance was a man with a very specific weakness: lampreys. Doctors warned him. His courtiers reportedly winced when they saw the menu. But Henry, like many kings before and after him, believed that rules were for other people, and that included the ones about digestion. On a cold November evening in Normandy, the king indulged himself in what may have been his favorite dish, despite a long history of gastric troubles. He ate, and he kept eating. Soon after, he was violently ill. Fever set in. The best physicians of the Anglo-Norman world, which is to say, the best people who knew how to bleed you and pray aggressively, were summoned, but no amount of leeching, herbs, or desperate last rites could reverse the effects. Within days, King Henry I was dead. It wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a geopolitical disaster. Henry's only legitimate son, William, had drowned years earlier in the White Ship disaster, a tragedy so famous that even its name sounds like a foreshadowed omen. With no male heir, Henry had named his daughter Matilda as successor, but 12th century England was not prepared to be ruled by a woman, even one as competent and iron-willed as Matilda. So when Henry died, the throne was up for grabs. What followed was nearly 2 decades of civil war, known as the Anarchy, a period of chaos where barons switched allegiances like socks, cities burned, and royal authority disintegrated. All of it because one man wouldn't say no to lampreys. And there's the irony. A king who spent his life tightening the screws of government, enforcing law and demanding obedience, lost everything not to battle or betrayal, but to his own unchecked appetite. He left a power vacuum so catastrophic it shook the monarchy for an entire generation. You might say the country choked on what the king swallowed. And yet, in a strange way, Henry's lamprey death feels perfectly tailored to his story. It wasn't violent or dramatic, it was quiet, stubborn, and entirely self-inflicted, like a final note scribbled in the margin of his life's manuscript. Even the most meticulous rulers can't plan their exits. Which brings us to another king, another warning ignored, and another beast entirely. Only this time, the creature wasn't on the menu. It was climbing the king's leg. 2 kings down, one felled by desert, the other by eel obsession. If you're still with us, you're exactly our kind of insomniac. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next absurd royal downfall. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? We're betting at least a few of you are deep in the YouTube rabbit hole past midnight. 3. King Alexander of Greece. If there's a hierarchy of strange royal deaths, King Alexander of Greece has a permanent seat near the top, somewhere between death by desert and death by lightning. His killer wasn't an assassin or a traitor or even a political rival. It was a monkey, 2 of them to be precise, and their tiny rebellion changed the course of Greek history. The year was 1920, and Europe was still staggering through the hangover of World War I. Greece had just clawed its way into a fragile modern identity, constitutional monarchy, national pride, and a king who had been chosen not because he wanted power, but because the people needed a symbol who looked steady on the balcony. That was Alexander, a young, handsome, well-intentioned man who found himself wearing a crown because his father, King Constantine I, had been exiled for supporting the Germans. Alexander's reign was meant to be simple, purely ceremonial. The real power lay with Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, a reformer steering Greece through a messy political metamorphosis. Alexander was, in theory, a placeholder king, a face for the postcards, a ribbon cutter for public parks, a signature for the paperwork. But in practice, he was a man trapped between loyalty to his family and duty to a people who viewed him as both royal and disposable. So perhaps it's fitting that his death was absurdly mundane. On an October afternoon in 1920, King Alexander went for a walk in the royal gardens at Tatoi Palace, accompanied only by his dog. Somewhere along the path, a pet monkey, possibly belonging to one of the palace's gardeners, attacked the dog. Alexander, trying to play the gallant rescuer, jumped in to pull them apart. A second monkey joined the chaos, biting and scratching the king's leg and hand. The attackers were small, but they left wounds. At first, the court dismissed the injuries as trivial. A few scratches, some blood, a bandage, nothing more. But infection doesn't care about royal bloodlines. In the weeks that followed, the king's condition deteriorated. Doctors, uncertain, limited by the medicine of the time, tried their best, but sepsis crept through his system. He died 3 weeks later at the age of 27. A king killed not in battle, not in scandal, but in the garden, by monkeys. If the story ended there, it would already be ridiculous. But history, never satisfied with irony in moderation, turned his death into a pivot point for a nation. Alexander's father was restored to the throne soon after. The resulting political instability pulled Greece into a spiral that led to the catastrophic Greco-Turkish War and ultimately to the fall of the monarchy itself, all from one monkey bite. Winston Churchill, years later, described the incident with typically grim humour. A king died of a monkey bite and a kingdom fell. It's the kind of line that sounds too poetic to be real, but it was. A monarchy undone not by politics, but by a primate's bad temper. And so the story of King Alexander lives on as one of those bizarre footnotes that historians whisper with a smirk. A reminder that sometimes the most fragile empires collapse under the weight of the smallest creatures. His death wasn't just strange, it was cosmically ironic. A symbol of how randomness, not grand design, often shapes the fate of nations. One might even call it the first modern example of chaos theory, the idea that the smallest act can change everything. Only this time, it wasn't a butterfly flapping its wings. It was a monkey baring its teeth. And speaking of fatal encounters between royalty and inanimate surroundings, the next king's downfall didn't involve a creature at all, just a doorframe and a very, very bad angle. 4. King Charles VIII of France. Some kings die with swords in their hands, others with crowns on their heads. Charles VIII of France, however, managed to die with a tennis match on his mind and a doorframe to blame. It was April 1498. Charles had ruled France since the age of 13, inheriting the throne from his father, Louis XI, a man so politically shrewd he was nicknamed the Universal Spider. But Charles wasn't a spider. If anything, he was the fly, nervous, impulsive, and often caught in webs he didn't know existed. He was young, short, and, let's be honest, not particularly gifted in the statesman department. He married Anne of Brittany, securing one of the most crucial territorial unions in French history. but that victory was orchestrated more by his advisors than his own wit. Charles's real passion wasn't governance. It was war games, architectural renovations, and apparently watching people hit balls with wooden paddles. Which brings us to the fateful day. The king was spending time at the Château d'Amboise, a palace so opulent and fortress-like it looked designed by someone with a fear of both poor people and bad taste. In between diplomatic negotiations and royal distractions, someone organized a friendly game of jeu de paume, an early version of tennis played indoors, often with bare hands. Charles, being an enthusiastic observer of sport and not one to miss a chance to escape royal duty, made his way down to the court. On the way, he had to pass through a low archway, not a hallway, not a tunnel, just a slightly awkward, slightly narrow doorframe that had clearly not been constructed with royal cranial safety in mind. Accounts differ on the details, but the core remains the same. Charles smacked his head against the stone. Hard. He stumbled. Then he laughed it off, as one does after colliding with a doorframe while several nobles are watching, but within minutes he began to feel faint. He collapsed. Physicians were called, bleeding was attempted, the 15th century version of turning it off and on again, but within hours the young king was dead from a tennis match via a doorway. France predictably spiraled. Charles died without a surviving male heir, ending the direct line of the Valois dynasty. His cousin, Louis of Orleans, took the throne as Louis XII, which triggered a reshuffling of alliances, rivalries, and yet another chapter in Europe's eternal hobby of territorial squabbling. But long before any of that, the nobility was left standing awkwardly around a corpse in a corridor, trying to make sense of it. A monarch brought down not by intrigue or illness, but by bad architecture. The event triggered a flurry of renovations in royal buildings across France. Doorframes were raised, ceilings modified. It turns out nothing motivates royal interior design like the sudden death of a king, and yet Charles's story holds a peculiar lesson that even in a life of palaces, power, and privilege, your biggest threat might be something as mundane as poor spatial awareness. But if you thought a head injury was a ridiculous way to go, imagine ruling England during the most violent power struggle in medieval Europe, only to be killed by your own toilet. 5. King Edmund II, Ironside of England. The early 11th century was not a gentle time. It was the kind of era where life expectancy was short, battlefields were long, and if your name wasn't something like Bloodaxe or Skull Splitter, you probably weren't doing it right. Enter King Edmund II of England, better known as Ironside, a nickname earned not for his administrative prowess or gentle reforms, but for being one of the most relentlessly durable fighters of his age. He ascended the throne in 1016 during one of the messiest inheritance crises in English history. His father, Ethelred the Unready, a name that speaks for itself, had left behind a fractured, exhausted kingdom under siege from Danish invaders. Edmund, unlike his father, was very much ready. He immediately launched into a full-blown war against Canute, or Cnut the Great, son of Danish King Sweyn Forkbeard, another man with a name that wouldn't look out of place in a heavy metal band. Edmund fought 5 major battles in 1 year. That's not a metaphor. 5 in 1 year, with minimal rest, limited resources, and an army stitched together from regional loyalties and sheer adrenaline. Despite the odds, he won several engagements and managed to halt the Danish advance at least temporarily. He didn't rule from behind walls or via envoys. He fought in the mud, sword in hand, bleeding with the rest of them, hence Ironside. But like many warriors before him, he was better at surviving war than surviving peace. After months of exhausting bloodshed, he agreed to divide the kingdom with Canute. Edmund would rule Wessex in the south, Canute would govern the north. It was a tense but necessary compromise, a rare political détente in an age of beheadings and betrayals. Unfortunately, Edmund didn't enjoy the arrangement for long. He died not long after the treaty, barely 7 months into his reign, and this is where the story slips from the battlefield into the shadows of bathroom folklore. Some sources claim he was assassinated while using the royal latrine, the so-called privy murder. The tale goes that an assassin had hidden in the pit below, delivering the fatal blow from beneath. Other accounts suggest poisoning or a sudden illness, but the toilet assassination version spread like wildfire across medieval Europe because, of course, it did. Nothing travels faster through court gossip than a gruesome death with architectural implications. The truth, no one knows. Chroniclers disagree, sources contradict each other, and historical revisionists have pointed out that the Privy story may have been nothing more than a smear campaign, possibly even literal. But what's undeniable is this: Edmund Ironside, the warrior king who stood toe-to-toe with the fiercest invaders of his era, died far from the battlefield and under ignoble circumstances. Canute became king of all England soon after, and Edmund's sons were exiled. The Danish conquest of England was complete. A king who had fought with every ounce of strength in his body was undone not by sword or siege, but by an ending too strange to confirm and too bizarre to forget. It's the kind of conclusion that leaves historians half smirking, half suspicious. Because if death is the great equalizer, then fate really seems to enjoy making the mighty look ridiculous. And speaking of ridiculous, the next king died doing what every royal advisor warned him not to do, standing next to a new invention during a live weapons demo. What could possibly go wrong? 6. King James II of Scotland. There's a special kind of irony in being blown to pieces by your own enthusiasm. For King James II of Scotland, that irony came in the form of a cannon, sleek, newly built, and nicknamed the Lion. James II was a man with many obsessions, consolidating royal power, neutralizing noble threats, and, most memorably, medieval artillery. The 15th century was a transitional time in warfare. Swords and spears were still fashionable, but gunpowder had entered the chat. Cannons were no longer novelty items, they were symbols of modernization, intimidation, and occasionally very poor judgment. He became king as a child after the murder of his father, James I, and spent much of his youth in a fog of regencies and noble backstabbing. Scotland at the time wasn't so much a united country as it was a simmering pot of clan rivalries, shifting alliances, and constant threats from England to the south. By the time James came of age, he had developed one very clear political strategy: reduce the nobility's power by any means necessary, preferably explosive ones, and it worked for a while. He cracked down on the overreaching Black Douglases, one of the most powerful aristocratic families in the realm, with a brutality that shocked even his contemporaries. He centralized authority, asserted royal dominance, and sought new technologies to give his crown an edge. Enter the cannon. In 1460, during a siege of Roxburgh Castle, one of the last English-held fortresses in Scotland, James brought out his prized artillery. Among them was the Lion, a massive, custom-built bombard meant to show off the sheer force of royal firepower. James wasn't content to leave the operation to his engineers or generals. He wanted a front-row seat. Eyewitnesses describe the moment with a kind of stunned awe, as James stood beside the cannon, giving orders, watching the preparation, likely thrilled at the imminent destruction of his enemy's walls. The Lion exploded. The reasons are speculative. Maybe it overheated, maybe the metal casing cracked, or maybe someone misjudged the amount of powder. Whatever the cause, the result was fatal. The cannon burst open with terrifying force, sending shards of iron and stone flying through the air and straight through the king. He died instantly. The reaction was stunned silence, then frantic attempts to maintain order. After all, you don't pause a siege because the king exploded. The Scottish forces, determined to make the king's death count for something, pushed forward and captured Roxburgh. Then, perhaps with a touch of grim logic, they destroyed the castle altogether, leaving no structure behind for England to reclaim. James left behind a young son, the future James III, and a country once again forced to navigate political upheaval without its central figure. His queen took control as regent, navigating through chaos with sharp intellect and cautious diplomacy, all while Scotland mourned a king who had flown a little too close to the cannonball. It's a strange legacy. James II wasn't remembered primarily for his policies or reforms, but for his death, a cautionary tale about standing too close to power in every sense of the word. He was a monarch, undone not by treachery, but by overconfidence in man-made thunder. And if you think being done in by a hunk of metal is a tragic way to go, wait until you hear what happened to a queen who died because no one dared to touch her, even as she slipped beneath the water. 7. Queen Sunanda Kumariratana of Siam. It's one thing to die tragically. It's another to die with your entire entourage watching. Not because they couldn't help, but because they legally weren't allowed to. That was the fate of Queen Sunanda Kumariratana of Siam, whose death in 1880 reads like a parable written by a committee of fatalists and bureaucrats. Sunanda was the consort and half-sister of King Chulalongkorn, Rama V, one of the most progressive monarchs Siam ever knew. He abolished slavery, modernized the country's institutions, and navigated colonial pressures from the British and French with almost supernatural finesse. But even a forward-thinking king couldn't undo the weight of centuries-old court customs overnight, especially the ones that governed how commoners were allowed to interact with royalty. One such law, deeply rooted in the rigid social hierarchy of the day, forbade any common subject from touching the queen, even accidentally, even in emergencies, even if her life depended on it. Touching royalty without explicit permission could mean execution. That was the law, and everyone knew it. On May the 31st, 1880, Queen Sunanda was travelling by royal barge along the Chao Phraya River en route to the Bang Pain summer palace. The river, muddy, unpredictable, swollen with the season's current, was not the ideal venue for peaceful gliding. Her barge capsized. She was flung into the water along with her young daughter and several attendants. Help was nearby. Guards and servants stood watching from accompanying boats. Many were trained, many were capable, but none moved. They watched as the queen thrashed and slipped under the water, paralyzed not by confusion or fear, but by law. No one dared to break the code. No one wanted to be the one who touched royalty. And so she drowned. The aftermath was, predictably, a public and political nightmare. King Chulalongkorn was reportedly devastated, not only by the loss of his wife and daughter, but by the senselessness of it all. He ordered arrests. Several of the guards were punished. He pushed forward reforms to dismantle the obsolete customs that had indirectly killed his family. But in a bitter twist of timing, those changes came just a little too late for the one person they would have saved. Sunanda's death became a symbolic rupture in Siam's royal tradition, a moment where the ritual of divinity collided with the reality of mortality. It exposed the human cost of deification, the dangers of being worshipped instead of protected. For years, school children in Thailand would hear the story not just as history, but as a cautionary tale. Not about rivers or boats, but about laws that forget the people they're meant to serve. And in a broader sense, Sunanda's story asks something larger. What happens when systems designed to honor the powerful end up ensuring their helplessness instead? It wouldn't be the last time a royal's death came by. Way of an ancient code clashing with basic survival. But sometimes it wasn't law or pride that did them in, just a tooth on a man who was already dead. 8. King Sigurd the Mighty of Orkney death for a Viking was supposed to be glorious, preferably loud, preferably bloody, preferably somewhere on a battlefield while holding a sword and shouting a dramatic final line. That's how legends are made. But King Sigurd Eysteinsson, better known as Sigurd the Mighty, took a different route. His demise wasn't in battle, but in the aftermath, and his killer a severed head. Let's rewind. Sigurd was one of the first Norse earls of Orkney, a collection of islands off the northern coast of Scotland. Around the late 9th century, give or take, since record-keeping back then was more of an optional hobby, he expanded his domain aggressively. He was ruthless, efficient, and apparently very committed to overkill. At some point in his bloody conquest of northern Scotland, Sigurd challenged a local chieftain named Maelbrigte, the Buck-Toothed, to a battle. Yes, that was his nickname, and yes, it turned out to be chillingly prophetic. The two sides agreed to meet in honourable combat, 40 men each, no tricks, just good old-fashioned Norse violence. But Sigurd, either misunderstanding the assignment or simply not caring, showed up with 80 men. He slaughtered Maelbrigte's forces and beheaded the fallen chieftain as a trophy. And here's where things took a strange turn. According to the Orkneyinga saga, Sigurd fastened Maelbrigte's head to his saddle as a gruesome souvenir of victory. He rode triumphantly back, bloodied and boastful, but as he galloped, the severed head, jostling with every movement, struck Sigurd's leg repeatedly. One of Maelbrigte's large buck teeth scratched to the earl's skin, just a small cut, a scrape, the kind of wound a warrior wouldn't even notice, but the scratch became infected. In the 9th century, that was essentially a death sentence with extra steps. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, just poultices, prayers, and wishful thinking. Within days, Sigurd the Mighty was dead, killed not by sword or axe or betrayal, but by the dental revenge of a decapitated enemy. There is something profoundly absurd about it. A Viking warlord, the kind who burned villages and terrorized coastlines, undone by the mouth of a corpse. It's hard to imagine a more ironic end. Or a quieter moral, don't gloat with your enemies, especially if their skulls are still sharp. His death became legend, not because of the battles he won, but because of how he lost to someone who was already dead. It's the kind of story sagas love, grim, poetic, and darkly comic. A reminder that victory isn't always the end, and that sometimes the final blow comes after the credits roll. And speaking of regal defeats by inanimate furniture, the next king was brought low not by a weapon or wound, but by his own ceremonial seat, which turned out to be far less supportive than his advisors. 9. King Bela I of Hungary. When most people imagine a royal death, they picture something vaguely dignified, a somber final breath in a lavish bedchamber perhaps, surrounded by trembling advisors and tastefully weeping courtiers. What they don't picture is a throne collapsing like a cheap folding chair at a family barbecue. And yet, that's exactly how King Bela I of Hungary left the stage, crushed by his own furniture. It was the year 1063, and Bela was already exhausted. He had clawed his way to the throne through a tangle of dynastic disputes, brotherly betrayal, and civil war. Hungary in the 11th century was not a peaceful retirement destination. It was a kingdom constantly balancing on the edge of chaos, pulled between pagan traditions, Christian reform, and a revolving door of foreign interests. Bela wasn't supposed to be king. His older brother, Andrew I, had worn the crown before him, but that relationship soured quickly. Andrew had promised the throne to Bela as a reward for loyal service, but, surprise, he changed his mind when he had a son of his own. Bela, understandably displeased, took the throne by force. Andrew died shortly after, either in battle or from injuries related to their conflict, depending on which chronicler you believe. So Bela ruled, not by divine right or orderly succession, but by sheer survival instinct and a decent sword arm. He was known for trying to strengthen Christianity in Hungary, continuing efforts to pull the kingdom closer to Western Europe. His reign wasn't long, only about 3 years, but it was eventful. The kind of rule where you wake up unsure if you're still king by nightfall, and then came the chair. As the story goes, Bela was attending a royal ceremony, possibly to reinforce his authority and present himself as the stable ruler Hungary needed. The throne, a heavy, ornate symbol of power, was brought out for the occasion. Whether it was improperly built, poorly positioned, or simply unlucky, no one knows. But when Bela sat down, it collapsed beneath him, and so did he. He suffered critical injuries from the fall, injuries that proved fatal not long after. The king, who had survived battles, betrayals, and the deadly ambitions of his own family, was undone by bad carpentry. There were no assassins, no uprisings, just a throne that turned out to be more symbolic than structural. For a man who had fought so hard to seize power, there's something haunting about dying in the very seat meant to embody that power. The throne wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was a declaration of legitimacy, and in Bela's case, it rejected him completely. His death led to more dynastic instability, as deaths always did back then, but it also left a lingering image burned into historical memory, a king crushed not by war or fate, but by the literal weight of kingship. And speaking of rulers done in by their own quest for greatness, the next emperor believed he could live forever. Unfortunately, his immortality formula came with a fairly short shelf life. 10. Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China. If you were the first man to unify a country as massive, ancient, and unruly as China, you'd probably assume the universe owed you something in return, perhaps a longer lease on life, maybe even eternity. Emperor Qin Shi Huang certainly thought so. And in a darkly poetic twist, it was that very obsession with immortality that killed him. Before his name became synonymous with terracotta warriors and colossal mausoleums, Qin Shi Huang was a warlord with a vision. By 221 BCE, he had conquered 6 rival kingdoms and declared himself the first emperor of a unified China, a title that didn't even exist before he invented it. He standardized weights and measures, unified currency, centralized the legal code, and began building the Great Wall. A man of ambition? Absolutely. A man of restraint? Not even close. But unification was only the beginning. He didn't just want to rule China, he wanted to rule it forever. That's when his fascination with immortality took a turn for the pharmaceutical. Qin surrounded himself with alchemists, mystics, and adventurers. He sent expeditions across oceans in search of magical islands where sages supposedly brewed eternal life elixirs. He built elaborate palaces, underground tombs, and vast secret tunnels, not just to impress future archaeologists, but to hide from death itself. And most importantly, he began consuming experimental immortality potions concocted by his court alchemists. The key ingredient? Mercury. Yes, mercury. The same toxic metal modern science warns you not to touch, breathe, or even look at for too long. In ancient China, however, it was thought to be a mystical substance, one that shimmered and danced like liquid silver. If something looked like it defied nature, surely it must be the key to defying death too. Qin drank mercury-laced potions regularly. The more paranoid he became about assassins, omens, and celestial warnings, the more he consumed. His behavior turned increasingly erratic. He trusted no one. He changed residences constantly. He issued absurd edicts, punished perceived disloyalty with vicious severity, and withdrew into deeper isolation. Then, during a tour of the eastern provinces, possibly in search of more immortality sources, he died. Official records simply say he fell ill. Historians, however, have little doubt. The man who wanted to outwit death was slowly poisoned by his own medicine. His body was rushed back to the capital in secret, the caravan filled with carts of rotting fish to mask the smell of the deceased emperor during the long journey home. His tomb, still largely unexcavated, is said to contain rivers of mercury and a replica of his empire in miniature, a final ironic monument to the very substance that ended him. Qin Shi Huang's legacy looms large, a man who founded an empire but couldn't outlive a bottle. His grand vision shaped the future of a civilization, but his fear of death sabotaged. The final chapter. And if you think that's an extreme response to mortality, wait until you hear what one English king supposedly had done to him, not for glory, not for immortality, but as an alleged punishment that sounds more like a medieval rumor mill set on fire. 11. King Edward II of England. Few monarchs in English history are wrapped in as much confusion, controversy, and posthumous slander as King Edward II. His reign was marked by political disaster, military failure, personal scandal, and more baronial backstabbing than a Shakespearean fan convention. But even with all that, it's his death that turned him into something closer to historical folklore than a straightforward sovereign. The official record, such as it is, claims that Edward II died in 1327 while imprisoned at Berkeley Castle. He had been forcibly removed from the throne the previous year, deposed by a coalition led by his own wife, Queen Isabella, and her ally and rumoured lover, Roger Mortimer. That alone would have secured Edward a reputation as one of England's more unfortunate kings. But what happened after his imprisonment is where things get strange and speculative and weirdly theatrical. Contemporary chroniclers, many of whom were writing under political pressure or religious bias, couldn't resist making Edward's demise into something salacious. Over time, the rumours snowballed. He wasn't just murdered, he was elaborately murdered. The most persistent story, recorded years after his death, claims he was executed in a particularly grotesque fashion, a form of punishment so lurid it feels less like a historical event and more like a medieval morality play gone off the rails. Modern historians are quick to note that this account likely originated as a piece of political propaganda, designed to demonize Edward, humiliate his legacy, and justify the actions of those who had deposed him. There's little contemporary evidence to support the more theatrical elements of the tale, and some records even suggest he might have survived in secret exile for years. But by then, the legend had taken on a life of its own. What we do know is this: Edward was an unpopular king, not just because he lost disastrously to the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn, or because he handed far too much power to a series of deeply divisive favourites like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, though that certainly didn't help. It was also because he simply didn't play the part of a king the way his peers expected. He preferred rustic hobbies over ruling, ignored the nobility's warnings, and seemed more interested in personal loyalty than political savvy. In a medieval world built on hierarchy and control, Edward's softness was seen not as compassion but as weakness. His downfall was engineered by those closest to him, and his death, whether quiet or theatrical, became a symbol of the chaos he left behind. His son, Edward III, would eventually restore the monarchy's reputation, but not before executing Roger Mortimer and banishing the more unsavoury legacies of his father's reign. And yet the very murkiness of Edward II's death is what keeps it alive in the public imagination. The lack of clarity, the whisper of cruelty, the tension between documented fact and outrageous rumour, it all adds up to a legacy built less on policy and more on posthumous myth. A king whose final moments are still debated 700 years later didn't just lose his crown. He became a story, and in royal history, that's often a stranger kind of immortality. But Edward wasn't the only monarch whose bathroom habits would end up immortalized in uncomfortable detail. One king didn't need a conspiracy or even a political rival, just a bowel movement at the wrong time and a heart that gave out on the most undignified of thrones. 12. King George II of Great Britain. Royal deaths are rarely dignified, but some manage to achieve a sort of tragic elegance, a final sigh in bed, a whispered goodbye surrounded by family and flickering candlelight. King George II of Great Britain, however, left this world in a way that was abrupt, clinical, and deeply undignified. He died in his bathroom, specifically after what was described with straight-faced 18th century formality as a sudden movement of the bowels. It was October 25, 1760. George II was 76 years old, no small feat for a man who'd lived through multiple wars, endless political infighting, and an empire in flux. Despite his reputation as a somewhat gruff, irritable monarch with a German accent thick enough to stir soup, he'd outlasted most of his contemporaries. His reign had seen the rise of parliamentary government, the strengthening of British naval power, and the early foundations of what would become the British Empire. But that morning, none of it mattered. At around 6 a.m., the king got out of bed and made his way to the royal water closet, a polite term for the small private room housing his porcelain throne. Moments later, a crashing sound was heard. His valet rushed in to find the king collapsed on the floor, unresponsive. The royal physician arrived quickly, but there was little to be done. George II had died almost instantly. The cause, a ruptured aortic aneurysm, essentially a burst artery near the heart. Modern doctors understand this as a freak medical event, sudden, catastrophic, and nearly always fatal. But at the time, the incident gained a strange kind of notoriety. The king's death on the toilet was whispered about with a mixture of awkwardness and fascination, and for years afterward, fallen from his stool became a grim euphemism passed around British society with a knowing smirk. In life, George II had been a peculiar blend of military bravado and bureaucratic impatience. He was the last British monarch to personally lead troops into battle, charging at the front lines during the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. At the same time, he was frequently exasperated by his ministers, famously muttering in German under his breath when annoyed. He had little time for culture, even less for ceremony, and a famously strained relationship with his son. His sudden private death, stripped of fanfare, politics, and pageantry, seemed almost ironic. A monarch who had governed an empire and marched with an army, quietly undone by a silent flaw in his own body. And yet, perhaps there's a kind of brutal honesty in it. George II didn't go out in battle, or in bed, or in a blaze of courtly drama. He died in the one place where even kings can't pretend they're anything but human. But if divine judgment comes in unexpected moments, Emperor Carus of Rome would have agreed, especially when the heavens themselves seem to throw down a lightning bolt in response to your ambitions. 13. Emperor Carus of Rome. In the long, chaotic scroll of Roman emperors, few have exits as strange or as theatrically convenient as Carus. His reign was brief, his ambitions towering, and his death struck down, it was said, by lightning. From the gods, perhaps, or from something far more political. Carus came to power in 283 CE, plucked from the relative obscurity of a senatorial military career by the usual Roman method. Someone ahead of him conveniently stopped breathing. He was declared emperor after the death of Probus, a ruler who had made the fatal mistake of trusting his own troops. Carus, more pragmatic, understood Rome's military was both sword and scepter, and he wielded both with enthusiasm. He wasted no time asserting dominance. Almost immediately, he launched a military campaign against the Sassanid Empire in Persia, aiming to recapture the fading glories of Rome's eastern frontier. His strategy was direct: invade boldly, win quickly, and remind everyone that Rome could still roar. Surprisingly, it worked at first. He marched through Mesopotamia, scored a string of victories, and reportedly reached the walls of Ctesiphon, the Persian capital. Rome's eastern legions hadn't felt this confident in decades. And then, as if summoned by divine editor's note, he died. The story goes that while camped along the Tigris River, Carus was inside his imperial tent when a bolt of lightning struck and killed him instantly. No warning, no fanfare, just an emperor mid-campaign, turned to ash by a flash from the sky. His body, when found, was reportedly unburned, but the tent was destroyed. To the Roman imagination, it was a clear message from the gods. Divine displeasure, hubris punished, a reminder that even emperors were subject to the celestial balance sheet. But let's pause before we canonize the thunderbolt. Modern historians are, understandably, skeptical. Lightning strikes are rare and a suspiciously tidy narrative device. It's far more likely that Carus succumbed to disease, heat stroke, or even assassination by one of his own men. After all, imperial succession in Rome often hinged on who held the nearest dagger. His sons, Carinus and Numerian, were conveniently on hand to take over, and may have seen the benefits of a story involving divine wrath rather than dirty politics. Yet the lightning version stuck. Why? Because it had flair. It made a point. Rome, for all its bureaucracy and military structure, still craved a touch of the mythic. Carus's thunderbolt death became the kind of story whispered around campfires and scribbled into the margins of military logs. It fed the idea that some emperors reached too high, burned too brightly, and were recalled by forces beyond the Senate's jurisdiction. He came to power in a flash and left in one. Whether by divine strike or human conspiracy, Carus is remembered less for his victories than for the suddenness of his erasure, a human footnote punctuated by cosmic punctuation. And while some rulers were yanked off stage by the heavens, others were taken down in ways far more suspicious, like an arrow loosed in the wrong direction during a hunting trip, one that just happened to find a king's chest instead of a deer. 14. King William II. Rufus of England. Some royal deaths feel like fate, others feel like theatre, but the death of King William II of England, known more commonly as William Rufus, thanks to his ruddy complexion and temper, feels suspiciously like an accident wrapped in a cover story tied with a bow labelled "Don't Ask Too Many Questions." The year was 1100. The location, the New Forest, a royal hunting ground in southern England, known less for its wildlife and more for its ability to swallow kings whole. William Rufus, the son of William the Conqueror, had been ruling England with an iron fist wrapped in a leather glove, one that was mostly used to slap barons and bishops. He was not, in the nicest possible terms, a universally beloved monarch. William's reign was marked by constant tension with the church, harsh taxation, and a personal style that leaned more toward brusque than benevolent. Chroniclers accused him of vanity, excess, and sacrilege. Even his own courtiers described him as difficult at parties. And yet, for all that, he was still king, and kings don't just disappear in the woods, except apparently when they do. On August 2nd, 1100, William set off on a hunting expedition with a group of nobles. Among them was Walter Tyrrell, a French nobleman and skilled archer. The details of what happened next are as hazy as the underbrush of the New Forest itself. According to the official account, a deer was spotted, Walter took aim, and his arrow struck the king, not the stag, right in the chest, instant death. Walter fled the scene immediately, which in any era is a strong indicator that the accident was not the kind you apologize for with a fruit basket. William's body was discovered by local peasants, transported unceremoniously on a cart to Winchester Cathedral, and buried without any royal fanfare. No grand mourning, no epic funeral procession, just a dead king and a long silence. Now, let's talk motive. William's younger brother Henry happened to be on the hunt that day, and he didn't waste time. Within hours he rode to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and was crowned king just 3 days later. Efficient, no? It's almost as if he had a plan, and a perfectly timed tragedy to help implement it. To this day, historians argue over whether William's death was truly an accident or a political murder disguised as woodland misfortune. There's no conclusive evidence either way, but the optics remain suspicious. An unpopular king with no legitimate heirs, a brother with ambition, a loyal courtier with a conveniently fatal shot, and a forest known for swallowing secrets. William Rufus became a legend not for how he ruled, but for how he died. A man brought down in the open woods, yet somehow buried under a pile of unanswered questions. And if political intrigue disguised as misfortune wasn't strange enough, imagine dying not in a hunt or a palace, but at your own feast. So stuffed from gluttony that your crown might as well have been a napkin. 15. King Philip II of France's son, Henry the Young King. Some royals never make it to the throne, yet still manage to live and die as if they had ruled a full disastrous reign. Henry the Young King, the eldest surviving son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, was one such royal. Crowned during his father's lifetime to secure the Plantagenet legacy, he was given the title of Young King, but never wielded real power. Instead, he wielded rebellion, arrogance, and, as fate would have it, a dangerously heavy fork. To understand his death, one has to understand the strange career of a king who was never really king. In 1170, at the age of 15, Henry was crowned co-monarch alongside his father, a symbolic move meant to secure succession and deter would-be usurpers. But as it turned out, giving a teenager a crown without responsibilities is more a recipe for disaster than stability. Henry wanted power, not just titles. He was charming, generous, and adored the spectacle of royalty, jousts, feasts, and the glamorous performance of kingship. But the actual work, not so much. Denied any real authority by his father, Henry rebelled multiple times, first with the support of his brothers, Richard, later the Lionheart, and Geoffrey, and their mother Eleanor, who may or may not have been orchestrating the entire family drama from the sidelines with a glass of Bordeaux. The rebellion failed, of course, but the young king wasn't done trying. By 1183, he was once again in open revolt. This time, he allied with mercenaries and regional lords in Aquitaine, demanding lands, power, and recognition. His campaign, however, was chaotic and ill-supplied. While besieging castles and dodging his father's increasingly irritated wrath, Henry did what any exhausted would-be monarch might do. He threw a feast, a grand one, excessive even by medieval standards. According to chroniclers, he gorged himself on food and wine, not in celebration, but in defiance. After days of riding and fighting, it was meant to be a moment of self-made grandeur. But not long after, he was bedridden. Some said dysentery, others pointed to food poisoning or complications from an ulcer. Regardless of the exact cause, the feast broke him. His body, pushed past its limits, gave out. As he lay dying at just 28 years old, Henry reportedly expressed deep regret. He asked to be laid on a bed of ashes, with a noose around his neck, as penance for the rebellion against his father. The image is dramatic, almost suspiciously theatrical, but the symbolism remains. A prince crowned too soon, consumed by pride, literally and figuratively devoured by the pageantry he adored. The title of Young King had once promised destiny. Instead, it became a kind of medieval punchline, a cautionary tale of what happens when ambition is fed too often and too well, until the banquet becomes a burial. And speaking of royal remedies that should have come with warning labels, our next emperor found himself on the receiving end of some highly questionable treatments involving holy soil, raw meat, and scrolls steeped in water. Spoiler, none of it worked. 16. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia. In the final years of his life, Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia, conqueror, modernizer, electric light enthusiast, found himself at the mercy of two forces he'd long believed he could outmaneuver: illness and superstition. And while his legacy was full of undeniable triumphs, it was the strange and tragic missteps at the very end that turned his death into something both darkly ironic and deeply human. Menelik II was no ordinary ruler. He was the architect of modern Ethiopia, the man who famously defeated an invading Italian army at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, a victory that sent shockwaves through every colonial power in Europe. Under his rule, Ethiopia became one of the few African nations to resist European colonization. He introduced railways, telegraphs, and even the first telephone line in sub-Saharan Africa. He was, by almost every measure, ahead of his time. And then, in 1906, he suffered a massive stroke. The once vigorous emperor was left partially paralyzed and severely weakened. His speech slurred, his movements slowed, and the palace began to operate in whispers and quiet panic. For the first time, Ethiopia's most commanding figure was confined to a sickbed, and that's where the real strangeness began. Traditional Ethiopian medicine, deeply intertwined with Orthodox Christian rituals and centuries-old beliefs, took center stage. At first, the emperor's court physicians tried conventional remedies, but as his condition worsened, the treatments became increasingly symbolic, spiritual, and baffling. Among the more memorable efforts was the consumption of raw meat, which was believed to restore vitality and strength. When that didn't work, the emperor was given holy soil, sacred earth taken from church grounds to be eaten as a conduit for divine healing. And then came the scrolls. Ancient scriptures were soaked in water, and that water was offered to Menelik as a kind of holy elixir. Prayers were chanted over his bed day and night. Priests walked in shifts, circling him with incense relics and chants that grew louder as the emperor grew weaker. He lingered like this for years, a living relic surrounded by spiritual remedies, bound by faith and ritual, as the modern empire he built paused in quiet confusion. His advisors struggled to maintain control. Succession debates swirled. Diplomats came and went, tiptoeing around a palace that had turned into something between a shrine and a hospice. Menelik II died in 1913, not with the fanfare of a conqueror or the resolution of a statesman, but surrounded by desperate rituals and sacred soil. He who once electrified a palace and outwitted colonial armies ended his life in a haze of incense and unread scrolls. His death was not a failure of medicine or faith, but of the uneasy overlap between the two. It symbolized a kingdom at a crossroads, caught between the medieval and the modern, between divine healing and clinical science. And if Menelik's demise was a slow unraveling of body and belief, the next king's death was the exact opposite, a bold charge into battle, made blindly, and with an ending as absurd as it was heroic. 17. King John of Bohemia. Some deaths are tragic, some are comic, and then there are those that sit in that peculiar in-between, so noble, so ill-advised, and so surreal that they leave you wondering whether the entire thing was a metaphor that forgot it was real life. King John of Bohemia's final act was precisely that, a battlefield death that played out like a chivalric ballad written by someone with a wicked sense of irony. Born in 1296 to the House of Luxembourg, John became King of Bohemia in 1310. He was the kind of monarch medieval scribes loved to write about, daring, restlessly adventurous, and just detached enough from the practical concerns of ruling to be both inspiring and inconvenient. He spent much of his reign away from his own kingdom, joining military campaigns, settling dynastic disputes, and bouncing between European courts like a monarch on a gap year. Bohemia itself, that he left mostly to bureaucrats and regents. He was a crusading noble by nature, always looking for the next fight. And as his legend grew, so did his sense of dramatic timing. By the 1340s, John was completely blind. Accounts vary on how quickly the blindness set in, but by the Battle of Crécy in 1346, there was no doubt the king couldn't see a thing. Most rulers, upon losing their sight, would have retired to a quiet castle and spent their final years listening to lute music and dictating their memoirs. But not John. When he heard that the French were facing off against the English at Crécy, one of the major battles of the 100 Years' War, he insisted on joining the fray. He was in his 50s, blind, and had no strategic role. But the idea of missing out on a major war for John was unthinkable. What happened next is the stuff of legends and questionable decisions. John ordered his squires to tie his horses' reins to those of 2 other knights. This makeshift human chariot was to lead him directly into the heat of battle, and they did. Blind, charging forward, sword drawn, yelling, "Lead me to the enemy!" And they did, straight into a storm of English arrows. The next day, his body was found on the field, surrounded by his loyal knights. They had all died together, their horses still bound. It was the kind of death that medieval chroniclers couldn't resist. A blind king riding into battle by sheer willpower and outdated chivalric code. It was brave, it was foolish, it was theatrical, and it was, in a way, exactly how John wanted to go. His crest, legend says, bore the words, "Ik dien, I serve." Even in death, he made it true, and while John died charging into battle without the benefit of sight, our next monarch died in much less heroic attire, stabbed in his sleep, not in armor, but in his underwear. A royal assassination as mundane as it was mysterious. 18. King Wenceslaus III of Bohemia. There's something uniquely humiliating about dying in your underwear, especially if you're a king. For Wenceslaus III of Bohemia, his reign was short, his ambitions were grand, and his death came quietly, awkwardly, and without a single crown in sight, not even a robe. Wenceslaus III, the last of the Przemyslid dynasty, was barely out of his teens when the throne of Bohemia fell into his lap. But titles came easy in medieval Europe. It was keeping them that proved tricky. By the time of his death in 1306, he was technically King of Hungary, in name, King of Bohemia, in fact, and claimed the title of King of Poland, on paper. It was a geographical overreach powered by dynastic luck and the kind of family politics that had more in common with a chessboard than a dinner table. He was ambitious, erratic, and wildly unprepared. He was also the last male heir of a once mighty dynasty, which in medieval terms meant he had just painted a very large target on his own back. In August 1306, Wenceslaus travelled to Olomouc in Moravia, a town in what is now the Czech Republic. He had plans to launch a military campaign into Poland to solidify his claim there. The mood was tense, the inheritance fragile, his court filled with opportunists and half-loyal nobles, but if he was worried, it didn't show. He stayed in a lodging house, not a fortified castle, and reportedly dismissed his guards for the evening. Whether that was confidence or carelessness is still up for debate. On the night of August the 4th, someone crept into his chamber and stabbed him. No fanfare, no last stand, no grand conspiracy revealed in candlelight. He was killed quietly in his bed, while unarmed, dressed in only his undergarments, a final indignity for a man raised to believe kingship was divine. No one was caught, no one confessed, no official suspects were ever brought to justice. Was it political rivals, disgruntled nobles, foreign agents, a personal vendetta? Centuries later, historians still don't know. Theories abound, but the murder remains unsolved, one of Bohemia's most enduring royal mysteries. Wenceslaus III's assassination didn't just end his reign, it ended his dynasty. With no male heir, the Przemyslid line died with him, plunging the region into a succession crisis and opening the gates for a cascade of political maneuvering that would reshape the Czech lands for generations. But what lingers isn't just the power vacuum, it's the image of a young king, full of titles and plans, undone in the most vulnerable, unceremonious way possible, asleep, unguarded, and very much unaware. And if Wenceslaus's death was quiet and strange, the next emperor's fate was anything but. Captured, humiliated, and reportedly used as furniture by a rival king, his story proves that sometimes death isn't even the worst part. 19. Emperor Valerian of Rome. If history has a cruel sense of humour, and all evidence suggests it does, then Emperor Valerian of Rome may be its most tragic punchline. His reign ended not in glorious battle, not in dignified exile, but in an ending so humiliating that even the most ruthless of Roman chroniclers wrote it down with a kind of stunned hesitation. Valerian began with promise. In 253 CE, during the peak chaos of the 3rd century crisis, a time when emperors rose and fell faster than provincial governors could carve their names into statues, Valerian was proclaimed emperor by his troops. He was experienced, respected, and seen as a stabilizing force. The empire was fragmenting under pressure from barbarian invasions, civil wars, and economic collapse, and Valerian's job was to keep the whole thing from disintegrating like wet parchment. For a while, he seemed up to the task. He delegated the Western Front to his son Gallienus and marched east to deal with the rising threat of the Sassanid Empire in Persia. The Roman military machine, however battered, still had teeth, and Valerian hoped to remind the east of Rome's imperial bite. He marched deep into Persian territory and confronted the forces of King Shapur I, but the campaign faltered. Whether from plague, overextension, or strategic miscalculation, Valerian found himself cornered near the city of Edessa. His army was weakened, his supply lines stretched, and his options evaporating by the hour. Then came the unthinkable. Valerian offered to negotiate. Shapur accepted and promptly betrayed him. Valerian was captured, alive, the only Roman emperor ever to be taken prisoner in battle. That in itself would have been enough for the history books. But what came next is where the line between history and horror begins to blur. According to Roman sources, particularly the historian Lactantius, who, it must be noted, despised Valerian for persecuting Christians, the emperor was subjected to humiliation so profound they sound theatrical. Shapur, it is said, used Valerian as a human footstool, literally. When mounting his horse, the Persian king would step on the bowed back of the Roman emperor. Eventually, when Valerian was no longer useful as furniture, he was reportedly executed and his body flayed, his skin dyed and stuffed as a trophy and kept on display in a Persian temple. It sounds impossible, absurd, but whether entirely true or embellished through Roman bitterness and propaganda, the humiliation was real enough to echo across centuries. Even the Romans, usually so eager to glorify or vilify their leaders, didn't quite know how to categorize Valerian's ending. He wasn't a martyr, he wasn't a hero, and he wasn't exactly a villain either. Just a man who gambled on diplomacy and lost everything. Not just his army, not just his freedom, but even his posthumous dignity. His son Gallienus did not attempt a rescue. Whether out of pragmatism or political calculus, he simply continued ruling in the West, leaving his father's fate as a cautionary tale scribbled between the lines of imperial history. And so Valerian's memory lingers in a strange space, less as a warning about military overreach and more as a dark reminder of how quickly the mighty can become props in someone else's story. But not all kings met their end in enemy hands or foreign temples. Some, like George I of Greece, met their fate walking a dog, peacefully, almost forgettably, until one bullet changed the path of an entire nation. 20. King George I of Greece. Some kings fall in battle, others perish in palaces, and then there are those who meet their end doing something so ordinary, so mundane, that their deaths feel almost cinematic, as if the universe wanted one final shot of irony to close the scene. King George I of Greece, who spent 5 decades steering a fragile monarchy through storms of revolution, invasion, and civil unrest, died in the middle of a quiet walk. No guards, no fanfare, just him, a companion, and a small dog. The year was 1913, and George I was, by all accounts, at the height of his popularity. His reign had started in 1863 under less than ideal circumstances. He was, after all, a Danish prince handpicked by the great powers to rule a country he barely knew. Greece, still recovering from decades of turmoil after its independence from the Ottoman Empire, was suspicious of foreign kings. But George proved unexpectedly effective. He learned the language. He stayed out of politics when it counted. He supported modernization without trampling over national pride, and he did something few monarchs in 19th century Europe could manage. He stuck around. Over the course of 50 years, George I helped give Greece a semblance of stability. He oversaw territorial expansions, balanced delicate alliances, and became something of a grandfather figure to a country perpetually hovering on the edge of crisis. And then, on March the 18th, 1913, just weeks after Greece's triumph in the First Balkan War, the king decided to take a stroll in Thessaloniki, a city newly annexed from the crumbling Ottoman Empire. It was supposed to be a symbol, a gesture of normalcy. He declined an armed escort. After all, the war was over. The people adored him. and what danger could possibly come during a walk with a small dog in a city he had just liberated. Enter Alexandros Shinas, a figure still shrouded in ambiguity. Accounts describe him as either a disgruntled anarchist, a mentally unstable man, or something more politically motivated. What's certain is that he approached the king on the street and shot him at close range. George died instantly. The reaction was one of collective disbelief, not just because the king was gone, but because of how casually he had been taken. No coup, no assassination plot unraveled through espionage, just a solitary gunman, a missed security detail, and an ordinary walk turned fatal. There was no great ideological statement attached to the murder, no manifesto, no revolutionary wave, just silence and shock. And perhaps that's why his death haunted Greece so deeply. After decades of wars, revolts, and royal intrigues, it was a simple stroll that ended the reign of one of its most enduring kings. George I's body was transported with solemn ceremony back to Athens. His funeral was attended by foreign dignitaries and thousands of grieving citizens. His legacy, already secure, was elevated to near mythic status. He had brought modernity, stability, and respect to the throne, and lost his life at the exact moment it looked like Greece might finally be heading toward peace. But peace never lingers long in history, and if George I's death was a quiet interruption in a life of order, the next royal's demise was a loud contradiction. A man who drank beer with monastic devotion until his Lent fast turned into a final act of irreversible dehydration. 21. Prince Sigismund of Bavaria. It takes a special kind of dedication to die from religious observance. But Prince Sigismund of Bavaria, a 16th century noble with a love of tradition, a taste for beer, and a fatal misunderstanding of nutritional science, managed exactly that. His end was slow, self-inflicted, and soaked in alcohol. Born in 1439 into the powerful Wittelsbach dynasty, Sigismund wasn't exactly built for legend. He wasn't a battlefield general, a grand reformer, or a feared tyrant. He was rather a classic Renaissance prince, a collector of titles, a patron of monasteries, and a man who preferred the quieter pleasures of court life over conquest. By the 1560s, he was the Duke of Bavaria Munich in all but name, holding enormous influence over the religious and political affairs of his state. Sigismund was also famously devout. Deeply Catholic, he supported monastic life, donated generously to the church, and took religious fasting very seriously. In the 16th century, Lent was no casual dietary inconvenience. It was a public, performative act of devotion, a time to renounce excess, demonstrate piety, and ideally survive on the barest of sustenance. But Sigismund, like many of his time, had discovered a loophole. You see, the Lenten fast prohibited solid food, but not liquid. And conveniently, Bavarian monks had been perfecting the art of high-calorie beer for centuries. These brews, often called liquid bread, were dense, unfiltered, and nourishing enough to technically keep a man alive without violating the rules. The monks drank it, so did the nobility, and Sigismund took that tradition to heart, and then well past the limits of safety. During one particularly intense Lent, Sigismund decided to observe the fast with absolute devotion, surviving almost entirely on beer, not just a little beer, gallons of it, enough to maintain his sense of religious virtue while slowly dehydrating his body, depriving it of nutrients, and overwhelming his kidneys. He reportedly consumed beer morning, noon, and night, treating it as both sustenance and sacrament. Food was barely touched, water even less so. What happened next was predictable, though perhaps not to Sigismund at the time. His health began to decline. He grew lethargic, then weak, then gravely ill. Contemporary reports say he became gaunt, confused, and feverish, and still he continued his fast. His attendants, caught between obedience and concern, watched as the prince's condition worsened. Doctors, who in 16th century Bavaria were often just slightly more educated brewers, were called in too late. Sigismund died before Easter. The official cause of death: complications from prolonged fasting. Unofficially, death by beer. His passing baffled and embarrassed the court. A pious prince, taken not by sword or sin, but by overzealous observance and the very drink his region had perfected. Bavaria, famed for its breweries, now had a royal martyr to hops and fermentation. But the moral wasn't lost on historians. Sigismund's death became a strange cautionary tale about the dangers of literalism and of mixing devotion with loopholes. And while he faded from history in a haze of holiness and barley, our next emperor met his end due to something far less abstract: a toe. Specifically, one gangrenous toe that made its exit before the emperor did. 22. Emperor Frederick III of the Holy Roman Empire. It is one of history's crueler jokes that a man who ruled one of the most complex and sprawling political entities in Europe for over 3 decades, an emperor surrounded by castles, councils, astrologers, and armies, was ultimately undone by a toe. Not a sword, not a coup, not an assassination, but a single rotting toe that refused to stay in its place quietly. Emperor Frederick III of the Holy Roman Empire ruled from 1440 until his death in 1493. His reign was long, stubborn, and famously uneventful in the flashy, medieval blockbuster sense. He wasn't a battlefield icon or a brilliant reformer. His style was slow, cautious, and bureaucratic, earning him the nickname Arch Sleepyhead from his more impatient contemporaries. He preferred diplomacy to warfare, marriage alliances to bloodshed, and delay to just about everything else. But for all his political torpor, Frederick's real talent was survival. He outlasted rivals, endured rebellions, and carefully expanded Habsburg influence, most notably through the strategic marriages that would eventually place his grandson, Charles V, at the helm of an empire where the sun famously never set. Frederick's motto, AIOU, often cryptically interpreted as Austria est imperare orbi universo, it is Austria's destiny to rule the world, was less prophecy than a long game, and he played it well until his foot betrayed him. In the early 1490s, Frederick began experiencing excruciating pain in one of his toes. Infection set in, likely due to diabetes, poor circulation, or simply age. At the time, medical understanding of gangrene was ambitious at best. Physicians attempted various remedies, from herbal salves to bloodletting, before finally concluding that amputation was the only option. Amputation, however, in the 15th century was not a refined affair. There were no antibiotics, no anesthesia beyond a stiff drink and someone to bite down on. And so, in 1493, at the age of 77, Frederick III, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, had his leg partially amputated to remove the necrotic toe. The surgery was as grim as expected, and it failed. The infection spread. Fever consumed him. He died weeks later in Linz, reportedly muttering final words that were morbidly poetic. The toe is gone, the emperor follows. Whether he actually said it or whether the line was polished posthumously by court chroniclers trying to make the emperor's exit more quotable is beside the point. The symbolism stuck. There's something almost tragicomically medieval about it all. The most powerful man in Central Europe brought low not by enemies or empire, but by biology. A swollen toe, likely ignored too long, quietly overruled imperial ambition and declared itself the final authority. Frederick's body was laid to rest in a grand tomb in St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, a masterpiece of Gothic sculpture, all for a man who spent most of his reign avoiding grandeur. And yet, it fits. Frederick's death, like his life, was slow, ironic, and deeply rooted in physical reality. Even the mighty can be undone by the smallest things. Of course, in the next royal tragedy, it wasn't an infection, nor politics, nor betrayal that claimed the monarch. It was something even more banal, a minor swelling behind the ear that turned fatal under candlelight and crude instruments. proving that even a teenage king is just one abscess away from becoming history. 23. King Francis II of France. There are kings who leave behind towering legacies, monuments, wars, epics, and then there are kings like Francis II of France who left behind a swelling behind his ear and a kingdom thrown into chaos. He was 15 when he took the throne, barely old enough to grow a beard, let alone wear a crown. And in the short, fevered year of his reign, he managed to become a political pawn, a fragile figurehead, and eventually a medical footnote. Francis II was the son of Henry II and Catherine de' Medici, born into the apex of Valois power. His destiny was royalty from the start, and he was married off young to the formidable Mary, Queen of Scots, in a union designed to unite France and Scotland against English interests. The wedding was lavish, symbolic, and deeply strategic, as royal marriages always were. But even amidst the pageantry, one thing was clear. Francis was not built for longevity. He was sickly, delicate, frequently ill, and surrounded by more power-hungry advisors than he had years on the throne. When his father died unexpectedly from a jousting accident, the kind of grand, fiery death befitting a Renaissance king, Francis was thrust onto the throne at age 15. Behind him stood the powerful Guise family, Catholic hardliners who used his frailty as a lever to tighten their grip on court politics. His mother, Catherine, watched warily as her influence was sidelined. France, meanwhile, simmered with rising tensions between Catholics and Protestants, tensions that would soon erupt into decades of brutal religious civil war. But Francis never lived to see that. His body had other plans. In late 1560, he began to suffer from ear pain and swelling. What started as a minor infection, an abscess behind the ear, probably worsened by the primitive hygiene and medicine of the time, rapidly escalated. The doctors, operating by candlelight and guesswork, attempted to drain it. They used lancets, heated metal, herbal poultices, anything that seemed vaguely medical, but nothing worked. The infection spread. Fever took over. His speech slurred. He collapsed. The court predictably panicked. Here was a boy king, newly married without an heir, visibly dying before their eyes. As he lay in his bed, surrounded by murmured prayers and fumbling physicians, France braced for another succession crisis. On December 5, 1560, Francis II died, not in battle, not by assassination, but from what today would likely be treatable with antibiotics and a 20-minute outpatient procedure. He was just 16. His death unleashed a power vacuum that destabilized the French monarchy for decades. Catherine de' Medici seized the regency for his 10-year-old brother Charles IX and began her long, ruthless career as power broker during one of France's bloodiest periods. The Guise family retreated, the Huguenots rallied, and France slid further into conflict. Francis, meanwhile, slipped almost quietly into history, remembered more as the fragile husband of Mary, Queen of Scots, than as a ruler in his own right. He reigned for barely over a year, but his death, mundane as it was, set off a chain reaction of factional conflict, religious warfare, and political scheming that defined French politics for the next half-century. And while he died from something almost insultingly ordinary, the emperor who follows him on our list refused all medical help entirely, insisting that faith and music would heal a mortal wound. Spoiler, they didn't. 24. Emperor Johannes IV of Ethiopia. Some rulers die with the sword in hand, others die trying to outrun the slow march of disease. And then there was Emperor Johannes IV of Ethiopia, a warrior king to the end, who met his fate not by refusing to fight, but by refusing to be healed. His death was not only tragic, it was a lesson in the limitations of conviction, the cost of faith, and the dangers of believing you're already halfway to sainthood. Johannes IV ruled Ethiopia from 1872 to 1889, a period when the empire was under constant pressure, not only from within, but from the outside world, where colonial powers were carving up the African continent like a cake no one had asked them to bake. He rose to power during a time of internal fragmentation and external threat. And yet, despite the odds, Johannes forged unity through sheer will, battlefield brilliance, and an uncompromising belief in divine purpose. His greatest accomplishment was arguably not just military, though he won more than his share of battles, but ideological. He made the Ethiopian Orthodox Church a cornerstone of national identity. Under his reign, faith wasn't simply a personal belief system. It was a political foundation, a weapon, and a moral compass rolled into one. But as history loves to remind us, it's the thing you lean on most that often breaks beneath you. In 1889, during a campaign against Mahdist forces from Sudan, Johannes found himself once again at the front line. This was not symbolic leadership from the rear. This was Johannes charging into battle, rifle in hand, alongside his soldiers. For a man in his 50s, it was remarkable. For an emperor, it was almost reckless. He was shot in the abdomen, a devastating wound, but not necessarily fatal, not immediately. His generals begged him to accept treatment. By that point, Ethiopia had access to some modern medical knowledge. Surgery, while primitive by modern standards, was possible. There were doctors, there were options, but Johannes refused. Instead, he demanded that priests surround him. He ordered hymns to be sung. Scripture was read. He was brought holy relics, anointed with sacred oils and encircled by candles and prayers. No knives, no interventions, only faith. He believed, as many did, that dying under divine light was more honorable than living by earthly means. To Johannes, the wound was not just a test of the flesh, it was a test of the soul. He refused the knife and embraced the scriptures. And as his condition worsened, he held fast to that belief, choosing spiritual purity over surgical risk. He died within the day. The fallout was immediate. With Johannes gone, Ethiopia was left in a power vacuum. The empire teetered. Rival factions scrambled for control. Into this chaos would rise Menelik II, another monarch whose story would end ironically in sacred soil and failed prayers. But Johannes's death remains singular in its paradox. A warrior emperor who feared no battlefield, who charged into enemy lines without blinking, but who, when faced with the quieter battlefield of the body, chose not to fight at all. And from a death ruled by faith, we move to a ruler undone by fantasy, a Roman emperor so convinced of his godhood that he turned his palace into a colosseum, and his trainer into his executioner. 25. Emperor Commodus of Rome. The Roman Empire produced its fair share of eccentric rulers, men who saw themselves as gods, philosophers, or chosen instruments of fate, but few embodied the dangerous mix of ego and theatre quite like Emperor Commodus. His death was less a tragedy than a punchline, a fitting end for a man who spent his reign performing the role of emperor as if it were a never-ending stage play. And in a way, it was. Commodus wasn't just killed, he was cancelled by his own delusions, his court, and finally by the hands of his personal trainer. Born in 161 CE, Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor whose stoic wisdom became a model of imperial virtue. That contrast alone would doom any successor. Where Marcus ruled with intellect and restraint, Commodus ruled with impulse and spectacle. He didn't want to govern Rome, he wanted to star in it. He became emperor at age 18, the first Roman ruler born to the purple, meaning he inherited the throne rather than clawed his way to it through politics or civil war. To the Roman elite, this should have been reassuring. Instead, it was their worst nightmare. Commodus treated the empire not as a state, but as a playground, renaming months after himself, demanding divine worship, and hosting elaborate games in which he personally appeared as a gladiator. That last part, the gladiator thing, was particularly offensive to the Roman Senate. Gladiators were slaves or prisoners, men fighting for survival, not honor. For an emperor to don their armor and step into the arena wasn't just shocking, it was sacrilege. But Commodus loved it. He fought hundreds of bouts, always winning, of course, mainly because no one dared to hit him. He would preen before the crowd, strike heroic poses, and demand thunderous applause. He considered himself a reincarnation of Hercules and had statues made depicting himself wearing a lion's skin and wielding a club. But beneath the spectacle, his reign was rotting. The empire was stable economically, but politically it was a disaster. Commodus neglected administration, leaving power in the hands of corrupt favorites. His paranoia grew. Advisors were executed, friends exiled, conspiracies imagined everywhere. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, as if the empire itself were his personal real estate portfolio. Eventually, his closest allies decided that if Rome was going to survive, Commodus had to exit the stage permanently. On December 31st, 192 CE, they struck. The plan began with poison, but Commodus vomited it up, so they called in someone he trusted implicitly, his personal trainer, Narcissus. It was a decision drenched in irony. The emperor, who had turned his life into a gladiatorial show, would die in one final private match, not in the arena, not before roaring crowds, but in his bathhouse, with his own instructor delivering the fatal blow. Rome exhaled. The Senate declared him a public enemy and ordered his statues destroyed. His death marked the end of the Antonine dynasty and the beginning of another round of chaos, civil war, and power grabs. Yet even in disgrace, Commodus refused to vanish from cultural memory. He became a symbol of leadership gone theatrical, the danger of mistaking applause for legitimacy, of confusing spectacle with strength. He wanted to be remembered as a god, a hero, a conqueror. Instead, history remembers him as a warning, the emperor who turned Rome into a circus and died when the curtain finally came down. And if Commodus's story was a performance that spiraled into tragedy, the next king's death could not have been more different. A quiet exit, shrouded in melancholy, so subdued that the official record listed his cause simply as grief. 26. King Henry VI of England. Some monarchs rule with iron fists, others with silver tongues. King Henry VI of England ruled, if you can call it that, with what can best be described as a very soft, trembling hand. His was not a reign of fire and fury, but one of silence, stammers, and long, vacant stares. And in the end, his death was every bit as quiet and ambiguous as his life. A passing so murky that historians still can't quite decide if he faded from grief or was gently nudged out of the way. Henry VI inherited the throne of England in 1422, at just 9 months old, after the death of his father, the legendary Henry V, a warrior king immortalized by Shakespeare and battlefield glory. His son, unfortunately, was the exact opposite. He grew up meek, scholarly, deeply pious, and almost allergic to conflict. The crown sat on his head, but it never quite seemed to fit. As he reached adulthood, Henry's reign began to unravel, or more accurately, it failed to ever quite hold together. The 100 Years' War collapsed into defeat. England lost its territories in France. The nobles began squabbling. Taxes rose. Loyalty waned, his advisors feuded. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, became the de facto leader of his court, while Henry faded increasingly into the background, known more for his spiritual devotion than for any political decision of consequence. Then came the mental breaks. In 1453, at the age of 31, Henry suffered a complete psychological collapse. For over a year, he reportedly said nothing, responded to no one, and stared blankly into space as England dissolved into civil war. His illness came and went, but his authority never recovered. The Wars of the Roses, a dynastic struggle between the houses of Lancaster, his family, and York, erupted in full force. Henry was a king in name only, carted from one stronghold to another like a holy relic, while rival nobles decided his fate in blood. He was deposed in 1461 by Edward IV of York, then briefly restored to the throne in 1470, only to be captured again months later. By 1471, Henry was imprisoned in the Tower of London, a place that had a long-standing habit of turning royal guests into royal ghosts. On the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry died. The official cause was listed rather poetically as melancholy. Grief, they said, a broken heart perhaps, after hearing that his son and heir had been killed in battle. No blood, no poison, just sorrow. But few believe that version of events. Edward IV had just reclaimed the throne and would hardly have risked leaving the deposed king alive as a symbol of resistance. Conveniently, Henry died the same night Edward returned to London. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the phrase died of melancholy was simply a polite Tudor euphemism for removed quietly. Either way, Henry's death marked the end of the Lancastrian line, and the end of a reign defined not by power, but by passivity. A man whose crown was always too heavy, whose mind was too fragile for politics, and whose gentleness, in an era of ruthless ambition, became his undoing. Yet his story lingered in English memory, not as a tyrant or a villain, but as something stranger, a king too soft for the age he lived in. And if Henry VI died a quiet, spectral death in the shadows of a tower, the next emperor on our list died from something far more tangible, a disease caught not on the battlefield or in a prison, but in a bedroom during a moment of royal indulgence that turned out to be far more contagious than charming. 27. Emperor Joseph I of Austria. In the grand halls of European royalty, few things have remained as consistent and quietly hazardous as royal infidelity. Affairs were practically institutionalized in the courts of Europe, passed down like titles and tapestries. But for Emperor Joseph I of Austria, one particularly ill-advised encounter didn't just result in scandal. It resulted in a terminal illness, a public health warning disguised as gossip, and an early death that reshaped the future of an empire. Joseph I was born into the powerful Habsburg dynasty, a family whose hobbies included accumulating crowns, intermarrying to the point of absurdity, and running half of Europe with a well-organized mixture of Catholic guilt and administrative paperwork. Joseph became Holy Roman Emperor in 1705, succeeding his father, Leopold I, during the thick of the War of the Spanish Succession. He was young, charismatic, ambitious, and like many of his predecessors, deeply confident in his own divine right to rule. He was also known for his charm, and by charm, of course, we mean his ability to collect mistresses at a rate rivaled only by tax reforms. Affairs were not unusual among monarchs, but Joseph's court had developed a particular reputation for its revolving doors, late-night visits, and the number of well-dressed nobles whose daughters had mysteriously taken up embroidery full-time. And then, around 1711, Joseph began to fall ill. Not all at once, but gradually. A persistent fever, strange rashes, fatigue, and a troubling decline in health that his physicians tried desperately to treat without quite understanding. The condition, although not named as such at the time, was likely smallpox, a disease that was then rampant across Europe, spread easily and often fatal. But there were whispers that Joseph's case had originated from a very particular source, a mistress. The infection, court gossip claimed, came from a liaison that turned not only sour, but septic. In Vienna it became known, half jokingly, half horrified, as the royal rash. Servants muttered it in corners. Physicians avoided the question. Nobles looked suddenly pale when invited to court. The emperor's health continued to deteriorate, and despite aggressive treatments, most of which involved bleeding, poultices, and a prayer-heavy medical regimen, nothing worked. On April the 17th, 1711, Joseph I died at the age of just 32. His death sent immediate shockwaves through the Habsburg Empire, not because of how he died, but because of what his death meant. Joseph had no surviving sons. His brother Charles was still fighting in Spain and had no heirs either. The entire Habsburg succession was thrown into disarray, leading eventually to the Pragmatic Sanction and the rise of his niece, Maria Theresa, a woman who would become one of the most powerful rulers in European history, but only after years of war sparked by the very succession crisis Joseph left behind. The irony of Joseph's death lingered, an emperor brought down not by battle or betrayal, but likely by a moment of royal indulgence, a small private decision that reshaped the entire political landscape of 18th century Europe. He ruled a continent, commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and was felled, most likely, by a fever that no crown could cure. And while Joseph's end came wrapped in silk sheets and courtly embarrassment, the next monarch met his fate gripping a rock face, a king whose royal leisure activity didn't involve wine, women, or war, but climbing cliffs, until, of course, one climb was just a little too steep. 28. King Albert I of Belgium. Some monarchs perish on the battlefield, others behind palace walls. King Albert I of Belgium, however, met his end on the edge of a cliff, not in war, not in exile, but during one of his favourite pastimes, mountaineering. He died doing what he loved, which sounds noble until you realise it involved scaling dangerous terrain alone, without supervision, as the head of a nation. The whole thing might read like an outdoor adventure gone wrong, if not for the strange rumours and lingering doubts that followed the fall. Albert of Austria was no ceremonial monarch. He was, by all accounts, a king who earned his people's respect not by birthright but by character. When Germany invaded Belgium in 1914, Albert refused to flee or capitulate. Instead, he took command of his army, leading Belgian troops in the defence of their homeland during World War I. His bravery earned him the nickname the Night King, a rare example of a modern European monarch with genuine battlefield credibility. After the war, Albert was celebrated as a national hero. He didn't revel in the trappings of monarchy. He was understated, physically robust, and more interested in science and nature than royal pomp. His love of the outdoors was well known. He was an avid hiker, skier, and most passionately, a climber. Belgium, not being rich in alpine opportunities, couldn't fully satisfy his enthusiasm, but he often found adventure in the rocky outcrops of the Ardennes. It was there, in the small village of Marche-les-Dames on February 17, 1934, that the 58-year-old king reportedly went for a solo climb, an ordinary outing, supposedly nothing too ambitious. But he never came back. His body was found hours later at the base of a cliff, lying among the rocks, his skull fractured. The scene was grim, the cause of death immediate, a fatal fall. The nation was stunned. The king, their war hero, their quiet modernizer, was gone in an instant. His funeral drew tens of thousands. Monuments were erected. Mourning crept into every public square. But almost immediately, questions began to swirl. Why was he climbing alone? Why was the area where his body was found, a relatively modest slope by climbing standards, described as too easy for an experienced mountaineer like Albert? Why did some local witnesses report strange noises or shadows? Why did a few newspapers only briefly and quietly hint at possible foul play? Officially, it was ruled an accident, a tragic misstep. Perhaps the weather was poor, the rock unstable, or his foot simply slipped. But unofficially, speculation has never fully disappeared. Some suggested suicide. Others whispered about political enemies or silent scandals too explosive for public record. None of it was ever proven. None of it was ever resolved. All that remained was a simple, brutal truth. A beloved king went up a cliff and didn't come back down the way he planned. Albert's death was a reminder that even those who command armies and lead nations are not immune to gravity, literal or metaphorical. His life was marked by grace under pressure, dignity in crisis, and a refusal to abandon his people in their darkest hour. His death, by contrast, was silent, sudden, and cloaked in uncertainty. And if Albert's fall left behind only questions, the next King's End offered no clarity either, just a single bullet, a trench inspection, and a mystery so murky that even centuries later no one can say who pulled the trigger or why. 29. King Charles XII of Sweden. In a career filled with war, exile, and obsession, it somehow makes perfect sense that King Charles XII of Sweden's death remains an unsolved mystery, a single gunshot fired in the shadows of a trench that silenced one of Europe's most relentless military monarchs. He was a man who had lived on the battlefield, marched across frozen rivers, eaten bread baked in rifle barrels, and outlasted the armies of Denmark, Poland, and Russia. But in the end, he was felled not by an army, but by a question that still has no answer. Who shot Charles XII? To understand the death, you have to understand the man. Charles came to the throne in 1697 at just 15 years old. Within 3 years, he was at war, the beginning of the Great Northern War, a sprawling conflict that would define his reign and nearly unmake Sweden's position as a major power. Charles was no armchair general. He led his men personally, fought in the trenches, slept on the ground, and endured the same hunger, cold, and mud as his soldiers. He famously refused to marry or indulge in court life, choosing instead the constant rhythm of campaigns, battles, and forced marches. His victories were stunning, especially early in the war, when he humiliated Denmark, Poland, Lithuania, and even Russia's Peter the Great on more than one occasion. But over time, his luck thinned. His infamous invasion of Russia in 1708, echoing the future failures of Napoleon and Hitler, ended disastrously at the Battle of Poltava. Charles fled to the Ottoman Empire and spent years in diplomatic limbo before finally returning home. Even then, he refused to give up. Weakened, broke, and increasingly isolated, Charles launched new campaigns, most notably in Norway, where he hoped to reclaim Sweden's waning influence. And then came November 30th, 1718. Charles was inspecting trenches near the fortress of Fredriksten during the siege of Halden. He lifted his head over the parapet, reportedly to observe enemy positions or issue orders, when a single shot rang out. The bullet, or musket ball, struck him in the head. He died instantly. The question is, who fired it? The official explanation was enemy fire. After all, he was exposed. The Norwegians certainly had guns, and Charles had always been reckless in battle, but the details quickly became muddied. The angle of the wound seemed unusual. Some accounts suggested the shot came from behind, from within his own lines. And unlike previous injuries, no attempt was made to rush him to safety or treat him. He was declared dead almost immediately. Whispers of assassination began almost at once. Had his own officers grown tired of his endless wars? Was the government, exhausted and bankrupt, complicit? Was it a rogue soldier, a calculated plot, or simply the randomness of war packaged conveniently in suspicion? 3 centuries later, no one knows for sure. Charles left no heirs and no will. His death ended the Swedish Empire's aggressive military era and ushered in a more parliamentary, restrained monarchy. His body was exhumed multiple times over the centuries in attempts to solve the mystery, but each time the result was the same: more speculation, no answers. His reign had been defined by clarity, direct orders, relentless campaigns, sharp lines of command. His death, in contrast, was a foggy silence broken only by the echo of a shot no one has ever claimed. And as Charles fell into history with a bullet and a question mark, the next king on our list wouldn't even get to rest after dying. Because for King Harold I of England, death was just the beginning, and the River Thames had one more insult left to deliver. 30. King Harold. Harefoot of England. Most monarchs get one death. King Harold I of England got 2, one during life, a fairly unremarkable demise given the standards of medieval royal expiration, and one after, when his body was unceremoniously dug up, beheaded and thrown into the River Thames. It's a tale that reads more like a cautionary legend than actual history, but the records are clear. Harold Harefoot was buried, then unburied, then thrown away like royal trash by a man with a crown and a grudge. Harold's rise to the throne was murky from the beginning. He was the illegitimate son of King Canute the Great, the Danish ruler who had conquered England and, according to legend, once tried to command the tides. When Canute died in 1035, his legitimate heir, Harthacnut, was away in Denmark, busy securing his position there. Into that vacuum stepped Harold. Not officially crowned at first, he served as regent. Then, over time, simply declared himself king. It was bold, opportunistic, and given the period, unsurprising. He ruled for about 5 years, from 1035 to 1040. His nickname, Harefoot, came from his reputed swiftness, likely more in battle and politics than in personality. While his reign wasn't especially bloody, it was turbulent. He dealt harshly with opponents, including Alfred Aetheling, the half-brother of Edward the Confessor, whose capture, blinding, and eventual death caused lasting outrage. Harold's grip on the throne was always tenuous, his legitimacy questionable, and his political alliances fragile. Then, in 1040, just as Harthacnut was preparing to invade England and reclaim what he saw as rightfully his, Harold died, abruptly and perhaps conveniently. The cause of death is uncertain. Some say illness, others suggest stress or an unidentified affliction. There are no surviving records of foul play, but the timing was impeccable. The day before Harthacnut's planned invasion fleet set sail. At first, Harold was buried with full honours in Westminster, a royal burial for a man who, whatever the controversy, had worn the crown. But Harthacnut, upon arriving and reclaiming the throne, made it very clear he wasn't interested in reconciliation or royal niceties. He ordered Harold's body exhumed. This alone was shocking. Even in the brutal landscape of medieval politics, desecrating a king's tomb was nearly unheard of. But Harthacnut wasn't finished. He had the body decapitated and, according to several chroniclers, thrown into a fen, or more sensationally, into the River Thames. A symbolic act of erasure, perhaps. A final insult to a rival brother. A public spectacle to show the world who truly ruled. Remarkably, Harold's remains didn't stay in the river. Some of his loyal followers later recovered the body and reburied it in a churchyard in London, far from Westminster's royal glow. No ceremony, no state mourning, just a quiet, unmarked grave for a man who had once called himself king. Harold Harefoot is remembered less for how he lived and more for how dramatically and repeatedly he didn't stay dead. His posthumous punishment was brutal, vindictive, and deeply symbolic. A crown revoked not just in life, but in death as well. And while Harold was denied peace in the afterlife, the next prince on our list met his end in the middle of something far more English than politics or revenge, a casual game of cricket, where one bad bounce turned into a fatal blow that no one saw coming. 31. Prince Frederick of Wales. There are few royal tragedies quite like that of Prince Frederick, son of King George II and father of the future King George III, a man who was technically almost King of Great Britain, and yet remains mostly remembered for his eccentricities, feuds, and one spectacularly unfortunate game of cricket. His death was as English as they come, a nobleman struck in the chest during sport who laughed off the injury, and then quietly died from it. Born in 1707, Frederick was raised in Hanover and didn't even meet his royal parents until his teenage years. That set the tone for the rest of his life. His relationship with King George II was famously toxic, the kind of generational family rift that might feel petty if it hadn't played out under chandeliers and over state matters. Father and son disagreed on politics, court appointments, religion, architecture, and most bitterly on what Frederick considered his rightful access to power. As Prince of Wales, Frederick was technically next in line, but George II gave him no influence. Instead, the prince became the figurehead of a rival court, positioning himself as a populist alternative to his austere father. He funded poets, artists, and musicians. He threw lavish parties and styled himself as a people's prince, though he was never quite popular enough for that title to stick. What did stick were the stories of a man who once stole his wife from the palace in the middle of the night to give birth somewhere not under his father's roof, just to make a political point. But despite all the drama, Frederick's death came not from court intrigue or dynastic war. It came from a cricket ball. In 1751, during a casual match, Frederick was struck in the chest by a fast-moving ball, not with lethal force, but hard enough to bruise. He laughed it off, as nobles do when injured in the presence of lessers. But within days, he became ill. His doctors, who had all the diagnostic precision of a blindfolded gambler, diagnosed a cold, possibly pleurisy, maybe pneumonia, possibly a blood clot from the trauma. Accounts vary. What is certain is that he died shortly thereafter at age 44, gasping for breath in his bedchamber, while the country prepared to crown him king one day. Instead, it would be his son, George III, who would inherit the throne and eventually lose America. Frederick's death was a royal anticlimax. He died not as a monarch, but as a royal what-if. He never sat on the throne, never fulfilled the plans he made for Britain, and never reconciled with his father. His legacy is a ghost of potential, the prince who never reigned, taken out by a moment of sporting misfortune. And while Frederick's end was quiet and deeply English, the next king on our list died in a haze of delusion, believing, quite literally, that his body was made of glass. 32. King Charles VI of France. There's madness, and then there's the kind of madness that becomes legend, the kind that breaks through centuries of historical noise and re-emerges as metaphor, warning, and black comedy all at once. King Charles VI of France was such a man, a ruler who began his reign with promise and ended it wandering palace halls, refusing to be touched, convinced he was made of glass. Charles became king at the age of 11 in 1380, a moment when France was reeling from the 100 Years' War, economic turmoil, and noble infighting. His early years offered hope. Handsome, intelligent, and crowned with the nickname Charles the Beloved, France needed stability, and for a while it seemed Charles might actually deliver it. But by his mid-20s, cracks had begun to show, literally. The first major episode occurred in 1392. Charles suddenly attacked his own knights during a journey through the forest, drawing his sword and lashing out without warning. He was subdued, but it was the beginning of something much darker. Periods of erratic behavior, paranoia, and catatonia began to cycle unpredictably. One day, he would be lucid and kingly. The next, he wouldn't recognize his wife or children. Eventually, a very specific delusion emerged. Charles believed he was made of glass, not metaphorically fragile, literally made of glass. He feared shattering if touched. He wore reinforced clothing. He banned sudden movements. He refused to allow anyone to approach him without permission. Courtiers walked on eggshells, terrified that a misplaced gesture would trigger a royal panic attack. This condition, now known in psychological literature as glass delusion, wasn't unique to Charles, but he was its most famous victim. His episodes became so frequent and debilitating that the French court essentially ruled around him. Factions formed, vying for influence during his periods of incapacitation. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, and his brother, the Duke of Orleans, became regents in all but name. Meanwhile, the Burgundians and Armagnacs tore the country apart in a civil conflict that made everything worse. France, during Charles VI's reign, was technically a monarchy. In practice, it was a slow-motion disaster, presided over by a man who was afraid of himself. He died in 1422, after 42 years on the throne, most of them spent in torment. By the end, he had lived through betrayal, invasion, and the signing of the Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited his own son and handed the French crown to England. His mind was shattered, and so was his kingdom. And yet, Charles is still remembered, not as a tyrant nor a fool, but as something more unsettling, a king so consumed by fragility that he embodied it. And as we move from kings made of glass to emperors taken out by mushrooms, the next royal learned that not every favorite meal is made with love, especially when it's prepared by your ambitious, scheming wife. 33. Emperor Claudius of Rome. When it comes to imperial exits, few are as heavily footnoted in suspicion or as laced with domestic irony as the death of Emperor Claudius. Ruler of the Roman Empire from 41 to 54 CE, Claudius spent much of his life being underestimated. He was born with a limp and a stutter, mocked by his family, and largely kept out of public view until a series of palace stabbings opened up a sudden path to power. And just when he'd finally cemented himself as a surprisingly capable leader, he was brought down by the one thing he always enjoyed without paranoia: his dinner. The dish in question? Mushrooms. Claudius wasn't supposed to be emperor. He was the awkward, scholarly uncle of Caligula, who, you may recall, ran Rome like a fever dream before being assassinated by his own guards. When the dust settled, the Praetorian Guard discovered Claudius cowering behind a curtain. Rather than execute him, they declared him emperor. Some say it was a joke, others say it was desperation. Claudius, however, took the job seriously, and against all odds, he ruled well. He expanded the empire, including the successful conquest of Britain, improved Rome's bureaucracy, and strengthened the judicial system. But he had one blind spot: his personal life. Claudius had a notorious weakness for marrying the wrong women. His fourth and final wife, Agrippina the Younger, was especially ambitious. She was also, uncomfortably, his niece. Agrippina had one goal: to make her son Nero, from a previous marriage, emperor. Claudius already had a biological son, Britannicus, but Agrippina played the long game. She convinced Claudius to adopt Nero, grooming the boy as heir and gradually sidelining Britannicus. Then, according to most ancient sources, she moved to remove the final obstacle: Claudius himself. On October 13, 54 CE, Claudius sat down for a meal, possibly prepared or overseen by Agrippina's people. He ate his favorite dish, mushrooms. Shortly after, he fell violently ill. Accounts vary. Some say he died that night, others that he lingered for hours or even days. Suetonius and Tacitus, never ones to miss a dramatic flourish, claim Agrippina sent in a corrupt doctor to finish the job with a poisoned feather under the guise of helping him vomit. Rome was told he had died naturally. Few believed it. Nero was immediately declared emperor. Britannicus, still a teenager, was kept alive for only a short while before he too died under suspicious circumstances. Agrippina's plan had worked for a time, but as history would have it, Nero would later have her executed as well. Roman family values were nothing if not consistent. Claudius's epitaph, according to the satirist Seneca, should have read, "He was murdered by his wife after eating mushrooms." The Roman people called them the food of the gods. Claudius in turn became one, and while Claudius died with a feast in his belly and betrayal at his back, our next monarch met his end from a very different kind of posthumous insult, a body not revered but mutilated and discarded. A king who lost not just his life but his legacy twice.